Before we get into it, it's worth remembering that from today's point of view, most of us would never think of collecting dead bodies or cleaning out someone's latrine as a dream job. At least, I really hope not. But back in the Middle Ages, a surprising number of occupations were looked down on or even considered taboo. It wasn't only because they were dirty or involved blood. In many cases, simply handling money or coming into contact with blood was enough for people, especially the church, to see those jobs in a negative light. So, let's dive into some of these unusual medieval professions and see why they carried such a bad reputation. While you're listening, think about your own job, and let me know in the comments how you think people in the Middle Ages, especially the church, would have judged it. Now, let's step back in time to the Middle Ages and explore a world filled with death, filth, and what many believed were deadly sins. The Contemptibles. Back in the early Middle Ages, the Catholic Church had enormous influence over how people viewed different occupations. A person's job could determine whether they were respected or looked down on, especially if that work was connected to one of the 7 deadly sins. The Church believed that the most honorable kind of labor reflected God's own act of creation. Because of that, farming was considered one of the noblest professions. Working the land and producing food was seen as a sacred duty. Skilled craftsmen, like blacksmiths, also earned respect because they used their own hands to shape raw materials into something useful. On the other hand, plenty of occupations carried a terrible reputation. Jobs that involved shedding blood were often viewed with suspicion or outright disgrace. Doctors, butchers, and surgeons all fell into that category. Surprisingly, people who dealt with money weren't much better off. Merchants were often looked down on because they didn't actually create anything themselves. Instead, they moved goods from one place to another, and many believed the profits they earned weren't truly deserved. Things became even worse for people whose work was believed to encourage or involve one of the deadly sins. Lust was considered one of the gravest offenses, so not only were people who sold sex condemned, but anyone connected to that world faced criticism as well. Bathhouse keepers, innkeepers, and tavern owners all found themselves under suspicion because they offered places where people could drink wine, gamble, dance, and indulge in pleasures that the church believed tempted people into sin. Greed, also known as avarice, stained the reputations of judges and lawyers who were often accused of putting wealth ahead of justice. Cooks could be criticized for encouraging gluttony, while soldiers faced condemnation for far more than simply fighting. Since their profession involved spilling blood, they were already considered spiritually vulnerable. According to the German philosopher Albertus Magnus, soldiers were especially at risk because war encouraged greed through the pursuit of spoils, vanity through displays of strength and glory, and, most seriously, the violation of the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," through the killing of innocent people. Even able-bodied beggars weren't spared from criticism. If they were capable of working but chose not to, they were accused of sloth, another of the deadly sins, and were judged harshly for it. With all that in mind, I've ranked these professions from the most respected to the most despised. So, let's jump in and see where each one lands. It might seem surprising today, but during the early Middle Ages, even the humble dishwasher was considered to have a contemptible job. Their daily routine revolved around scrubbing wooden and tin plates, earthenware dishes, metal pots, and all kinds of cooking utensils. Most of the washing was done by hand in a bucket or large container filled with water. To remove stubborn grease and grime, they relied on a simple cloth along with sand or lye ash, which served as their cleaning agents. The work was incredibly hard on the body. Constantly handling harsh cleaning materials and standing in dirty, contaminated water often left their hands rough, cracked, and painfully sore. The conditions weren't pleasant either. Dishwashers, often known as scullions, usually worked in the least desirable part of the kitchen. They spent long hours on cold stone floors tucked away in the back of the building, and in some places, they even had to wash dishes outdoors, no matter what the weather was like. Among the kitchen staff, scullions occupied the very bottom of the social ladder. They received little respect, and their work was seen as menial and unimportant. The Italian Dominican friar and philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas even described them as the lowest of the low, believing their duties required neither dignity nor intellectual skill. A huge part of the medieval economy depended on the wool trade, and countless people earned their living from it. Most of the spinning and weaving of wool and flax into cloth was done at home, usually by women and children. Since the spinning wheel didn't become common in Europe until the 13th century, producing cloth was slow, exhausting, and incredibly time-consuming. But once the cloth came off the loom, the hardest part of the process was still ahead. One of the most unpleasant jobs in the entire textile industry belonged to the fuller. Unlike most textile workers, fullers relied more on their feet than their hands to do their work. Freshly woven cloth wasn't ready to wear. It needed to be softened. The loose weave had to be tightened, and the natural grease left in the wool had to be removed. To make that happen, the cloth was placed into large vats filled with stale human urine. Then the fuller climbed in and spent hours trampling the fabric with their bare feet until it was properly treated. Just imagine doing that day after day. You'd be standing ankle-deep in cold, stale, eye-watering urine that attracted swarms of flies, stomping on soaking wet cloth for hours at a time. It was filthy, exhausting work, and it's easy to see why so few people would have wanted the job. During the Middle Ages, bloodletting was a thriving business and one of the most common medical treatments of the time. Most physicians believed it could prevent illness and even cure a wide range of diseases. The idea was simple. By removing blood, they thought they were draining harmful substances out of the body and restoring a person's health. One method involved making a small cut on the inside of the patient's arm, just below the elbow, and collecting the blood in a container. Another popular technique relied on leeches. These blood-sucking creatures were valued because they not only removed blood, but were also believed to help clean wounds by feeding on damaged or decaying tissue. As a result, leeches were always in high demand, creating work for people known as leech collectors. Since leeches thrived in marshes and wetlands, collectors had to wade into shallow, muddy water with their bare legs exposed. They would stand there patiently until the leeches attached themselves to their skin. Once enough had latched on, the collectors carefully pulled them off and placed them into containers to be sold back in town. It was a miserable and dangerous way to earn a living. Because leeches release a substance in their saliva that prevents blood from clotting, the bite marks continued to bleed long after the leeches were removed. In some cases, collectors lost so much blood that they became weak or even felt faint. On top of that, those open wounds were constantly exposed to whatever bacteria, parasites, or diseases were lurking in the stagnant marsh water. As a result, leech collectors faced the risk of serious illnesses, including Weil's disease, parasitic infections, and even malaria. It was a gruesome occupation with plenty of hazards that came with the job. Need a haircut? Or maybe you needed a leg amputated? Believe it or not, during the Middle Ages, you could go to the very same person for both. The barber surgeon wasn't just there to trim hair and shave beards. He also handled many of the medical procedures that people couldn't afford to have done by a physician. Because barber surgeons were far more common and much less expensive than trained doctors, they became the first stop for all kinds of treatments. If you had a deep wound that needed to be cauterized, a broken bone that had to be set, a cataract that needed removing, or a painful boil that had to be lanced, this was the person you went to. They also performed bloodletting, which was believed to help keep the body healthy. In fact, this was where leech collectors usually brought their freshly gathered leeches to sell. Pain relief did exist, but only people with enough money could usually afford anesthetics. Everyone else had to make do with whatever alcohol they could drink beforehand and hope they could survive the pain. During the procedure, the barber surgeon's apprentice often had the unpleasant job of holding the patient still while the operation was carried out. The barber surgeon also had one important rule: payment came first. After all, there was no guarantee the patient would survive the operation, so collecting the fee afterward wasn't always an option. It was brutal, bloody work performed in poorly lit rooms with only a handful of basic tools, such as a scalpel, a straight razor, or a sharp knife. And if all of that still wasn't enough to make you think twice about paying a visit, remember that if you showed up with a toothache, the barber surgeon would be more than willing to pull out a few teeth while you were there. For many executioners in the Middle Ages, the job wasn't something they chose. More often than not, they were forced into the role, and once they had it, the position usually stayed within the family, passing from father to son. It's hard to imagine, but a boy could begin learning the trade as an apprentice when he was only 11 or 12 years old. Executioners acted under the authority of the law. They were given official warrants that protected them from criminal prosecution, and because they carried out legal sentences, the church generally did not consider them guilty of murder. Even so, that legal protection did little to change public opinion. Most people believed executioners were cursed, and they treated them as social outcasts. Because of that stigma, executioners and their families were often forced to live on the outskirts of town, far from everyone else. They were shunned by their neighbors and frequently banned from many public places, including bathhouses and, in some cases, even churches. Despite what many people imagine today, executions weren't an everyday event. To earn their living, executioners were expected to perform several other unpleasant duties as well. They removed the carcasses of dead animals, disposed of human corpses, and were sometimes responsible for driving people with leprosy out of town. It was a line of work that demanded a strong stomach and an unusually hardened mindset. Whether the sentence involved flogging, hanging, beheading, or burning someone at the stake, the executioner was the one expected to carry it out. The punishment for treason was especially horrifying. A convicted traitor was dragged to the gallows on a wooden hurdle before being stripped and subjected to an exceptionally brutal execution. Traditionally, the prisoner was hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled, emasculated, and finally cut into 4 pieces. By the early 15th century, the order of the punishment had changed slightly, with the disembowelment taking place before the hanging. One infamous example was John Hall, who was executed at Tyburn in 1399. Historical accounts describe how he was disemboweled, and his entrails were burned in front of him. After that, he was hanged, beheaded, and finally quartered. As horrifying as it sounds, the executioner even had to tie off the victim's intestines during the process. The grim purpose was to keep the prisoner alive long enough to witness the burning of his own entrails before the execution continued. It was one of the most disturbing responsibilities imaginable. If none of that sounds appealing, there's at least one thing that might catch your attention: the pay. By the 13th century, an executioner could earn as much as 5 shillings for carrying out a single execution. That was close to a full month's wages for many skilled workers. In some cases, the prisoner's family might even offer extra money in the hope that their loved one would receive a quicker and less painful death. Even with those generous wages, though, it's hard to imagine the money making up for the physical demands, the emotional burden, and the lifelong isolation that came with being an executioner. By now, you've probably figured out that sanitation during the Middle Ages was far from ideal. Cesspits certainly didn't clean themselves, and somebody had to deal with the mess. That's where the gong farmer came in. Most of their work was done under the cover of darkness. Night after night, they climbed down into cesspits connected to both public and private latrines and shoveled out human waste by hand. In some cases, the pits were so deep that the workers found themselves standing in filth almost up to their necks. The job was as unpleasant as it sounds. The gong farmer would fill buckets with waste and pass them up to young assistants waiting above. Once the pit had been emptied, the waste was loaded onto a horse-drawn cart and hauled far away from the town before being dumped in designated areas. In large cities like London, this meant removing thousands of gallons of rotting human waste on a regular basis just to keep the streets and neighborhoods from becoming even more unsanitary. The pay was actually fairly decent, but it reflected just how dangerous the work could be. Gong farmers constantly risked picking up parasitic worms and other diseases. They also had to deal with toxic fumes rising from the pits, which could cause them to lose consciousness. Even worse, there was always the risk of slipping, falling into the cesspit, and drowning in the waste itself. That's exactly what happened in 1326 when a gong farmer named Richard the Raker reportedly fell into a cesspit while working and lost his life. Because of the nature of their profession, gong farmers were treated as social outcasts. Most people avoided them whenever possible, and they often lived away from the rest of the population. After spending an entire night covered in filth, they couldn't simply head home and take a hot shower either. Clean water was limited, so washing thoroughly after work often wasn't an option. In the late 1340s, Europe was struck by a disaster so devastating that many people believed the end of the world had arrived. The outbreak we now call the Black Death swept across the continent with incredible speed, killing millions of people and wiping out what historians believe may have been nearly half of Europe's population. Death became so common that countless victims had no family or friends left alive to mourn them or give them a proper burial. Some collapsed and died in the streets, while others took their last breath alone inside their own homes. Before long, villages, towns, and cities were filled with decomposing bodies, and someone had to remove them. That's when a new and deeply unpleasant profession emerged, the body collector. These workers spent their days clearing the dead from streets and neighborhoods. They also went door to door, collecting bodies that grieving families had placed outside their homes for removal. The corpses were stacked onto large carts until they were full, and then hauled away to mass burial sites. There were simply too many victims to bury each person in an individual grave. Churchyards quickly ran out of consecrated ground, so enormous trenches were dug instead. The bodies were tipped into these mass graves one after another until the pits were completely full. Once filled, the graves were covered with soil, and the body collectors headed back into town to begin the grim process all over again. It must have felt like a never-ending cycle of death. It's no surprise that body collectors became some of the most hated people of the time. Many charged grieving families large sums of money to remove the bodies of their loved ones, and resentment toward them grew quickly. The Italian writer and poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, described the corpse carriers as men drawn from the lowest ranks of society. He wrote about gangs of grave diggers who wandered the streets surrounded by the constant presence of death while earning more money than they had ever seen before. Not every body collector abused the job, but some certainly did. Historical accounts claim that a number of them demanded outrageous fees or accepted bribes before agreeing to remove a corpse. Others were even accused of threatening to murder healthy people and pass the deaths off as plague victims unless they were paid. Several chronicles also describe collectors behaving disgracefully by laughing, drinking heavily, and harassing innocent people while carrying out their work. It's easy to understand why grieving families would have despised anyone who appeared to celebrate while profiting from so much suffering. Still, there was a grim sense of justice in the fact that many body collectors eventually caught the plague themselves. By performing one of the most dangerous yet necessary jobs of the medieval world, a great number of them ultimately became victims of the very disease they were hired to confront. That brings us to the end of this journey through some of the most feared and despised occupations of the Middle Ages. Thanks so much for sticking with me all the way through. If you enjoyed hearing about these strange and often horrifying jobs, I'd really appreciate your support. A simple like, comment, and subscription goes a long way and helps the channel continue to grow. And if you'd like to support it even further, there are membership options available with extra bonus content for those who are interested. Either way, I'm grateful that you spent your time here with me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time with another story from the medieval world.